Thank you, very much, and very pleased to be here. My talk will be mostly about recent projects, but I'm going to begin. The exhibition is actually divided into two, really. It's work from the 70s and work from the 2000s, and so my talk will follow that format to some degree. I'll talk less about the early work than the later, and then at the end... thank you. That looks like fun. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about projects that take place outside the museum in public spaces. I began as an artist doing performances, and they took the form of grids of small fires that were enacted in the landscape in the middle of nowhere. And when you make something in a remote place that it happens only once, you suddenly realize that you have a documentation issue and it's necessary to document it. And that's actually how I began making films. I actually learned to make a film in order to document a performance. This first film, I'm just going to show you a brief clip. It's called Landscape for Fire. It was made in 1972. So, having made the film, I then began to show it to colleagues and so on in alternative spaces or in people's apartments. And but really, for me, it was the performance that I was interested in. The film was just my way of showing people what it was. And I became aware of a paradox that at the moment of projection, the performance was twice removed from the actual thing. The film was in the past, the performance was in the past in the film, and occurred in an elsewhere other than the projection space in which we were looking at the film. And I began to ask if it was possible to make a film that only existed at the moment it was projected. And it was in response to this question that I made a film called Line Describing a Cone. It was in 1973. And it begins with this dot at the foot of the screen. And the dot very, very slowly traces a circle. And it takes 30 minutes to do that. The speed is completely even. So at the end, this is about 24 minutes into the film, and at 30 minutes at the end, it completes itself. But you don't so much look at the line drawing on the wall. What you see is instead a volumetric form that's developing in three-dimensional space. And the conical form incorporates the spectator. So you can be inside, you can be outside, you walk to the left, to the right, and so it's not only in fact a cinematic object, but it's also a sculptural object, in the sense that when you move, you change what you see. This is a shot of the piece being shown at Artist Space in New York in 1974, which was in fact one of the first screenings it ever had. This is what I said about Line Describing a Cone at the time. Quote, "The film exists only in the present, the moment of projection. It refers to nothing beyond this real time. It contains no illusion. It is a primary experience, not secondary, i.e., the space is real, not referential. The time is real, not referential." Meanwhile, I continued to make the fire performances. And I hit a difficulty at a certain point, or became aware of one, which is that increasingly it seemed as if the people that came to watch the piece being acted out were expecting a show. And they were invariably disappointed, partly because my attitude towards people watching was that they were witnesses to a sculptural process, not the audience of a show. And I gradually developed a solution to this problem. In the first case, I expanded the spatial field so that until there was no object, but merely an entire field defined by points of fire, which incorporated all the people watching. And secondly, and very important, I expanded the duration. So, I mean, if you have a 20-minute event or a 50-minute event or a 90-minute event, that produces what we call an audience, an assembly of people who come to watch the thing together. But if you make it for 2 hours, if you make it for 4 hours or 6 hours or all day, an audience doesn't form at all. Instead, you have individual spectators coming and going on their own time, visitors, if you like. And I applied these same strategies to my next big film, which was a year or two after Mine's Going Again. This is a long film for 4 projectors, an installation drawing. If you look at it, you can see that if you walk into that room, you're inside the film. You can't look away from it exactly. It's a field which incorporates you, and there isn't a front or a back, but a field which you're completely inside. And the other important thing is this had a continuous cyclical structure such that the minimum cycle time was 5.5 hours, and that meant that people, it produced an individual spectator who came and went, and that the kind of attention that brought with it was suited me very well. And here it is installed. It's a sort of dense thicket of interpenetrating planes of light. Essentially, these blades of light are passing through the space and through one another at different speeds or at different frequencies of light. So there's actually a lot going on, but it's basically a continuous motion in every direction. So the following year I made 4 projected movements. Now this is a distillation of the events of long film for 4 projectors. In this one, a single blade of light passes through 90 degrees. However, notice that the projector is in the corner. I don't know if this actually works. There we go. Projector is in the corner of the space. Projecting along the wall. So everything that happens in relation to the wall and the floor. So there's a sort of engagement with the architectural space, but also with the body of the spectator, because this blade of light, in this particular movement, pushes down against the wall. So you have to decide how you're going to act when that happens. You're either going to allow yourself to be pressed into the room, you're going to pass through the blade and go outside of it and turn around and so on. And this is the piece installed at Swiss Margers in Berlin. The projector's up there at the top. And here it is looking in the other direction, looking toward the people looking. And this, importantly for this piece, is a 60mm projector. Now film, as I'm sure most of you know, is a flat ribbon, plastic wound around a reel. transparent, and that flat strip can in fact be passed through this projector 4 different ways. Now, this film has one 15-minute reel, which produces the 90 movement through 90 degrees. But by projecting it forwards, backwards, forwards or backwards, forwards inside out or backwards inside out, that produces 4 entirely different spatial movements from the same reel of film. So you can see this diagram in this announcement. And also notice the arrow going around to the beginning. This is a cyclical structure, so there is, you can enter this film and leave it at any moment. You can watch it for 15 minutes, you can watch it for 3 hours. It's, there is no beginning, middle, or end. Now, I'd just like to pause here. We've been looking at just a few works from the 70s. Now, I then took a break. As it turned out, it lasted 20 years. And during that time, I was doing other things other than making art. And I would just pass on with that, except that when there are questions, I always get asked about it. So I feel duty-bound to just quickly talk about this little interregnum. You know, I felt that I'd completed the Solid Light series. I haven't shown you everything, but it had kind of come, I rounded it off, I finished it, I felt. There was absolutely no question of having a career making this kind of work. Galleries didn't show moving image work at that time, on the whole. And so there was a making a living problem. But there was actually a major other problem, which is a really big aesthetic stumbling block, which was that these films were shown in alternative spaces, like Artist Space. They were shown in avant-garde film places like Millennium Film Workshop, Collective Living Cinema, the London Filmmakers Co-op, and so on. Those spaces were all old warehouses or old factories, which were full of dust. And it turned out, when I started to show in clean spaces like museums or Kunsthaus, that was the medium, which I hadn't even realized. And plus, at the time, people smoked quite a bit too, so between the dust in the air and the smoke from the cigarettes, the films were always perfectly visible. But once I was in a brand new Kunsthaus or a museum with beautifully clean atmosphere and no smoking, the films vanished. And this was a bit of a shock. And I thought maybe I'd made a very bad aesthetic error. At any rate, I had to make a living, and so anyway, 20 years went by, and around 2000 or 2001, I began again. By that time, lots of things had happened, including the invention of the Haze machine, and including, importantly, the entry of video into the art world, which changed the whole that whole problem of the moving image. So the material conditions had changed greatly by then. So, just to summarize, during that's kind of formal means, during the 70s I worked with essentially 2 forms, circle and a straight line. And when I started again, around 2000, 2001, I added a third, which is, I call the travelling wave. And the travelling wave is rather interesting because a waveform simply repeats itself. But while it's doing so, it moves at a certain speed as it goes through the frame, and it changes height relative to the standing spectator. And so you can be in troughs or under arches. It can pass across your body. All very suggestive things for making a film. So, the first film I made in the new period was made in 2003 called Doubling Back. And I utilised the travelling wave. And this is almost self-explanatory, this diagram. But you can see this wave is going sideways, moving slowly through the frame. And this identical travelling wave is moving vertically through the frame. That's all that's going on. They're both moving very slowly and at the same speed. And this produces pockets of space. You see, if you follow this around, there are 3 minutes between each picture. By the way, the colours, just to clarify which wave is which. And obviously this was a white line on a black background. But you can see how it develops into all kinds of different forms. So, you can probably now decipher the two waves in this screen grab. There's the horizontal one going through the frame, and there's the vertical one. And here's an installation drawing. Now, just like in 4 projected movements, which you saw, I have the projector in the corner. I'm projecting along the wall. So there's not only internal volumes and internal chambers are developing, but also the relationship, the whole form against the wall and the floor is producing pockets of space also. So these installation drawings are 3 minutes apart. So you can see there's quite this, the form starts off closed, it unfolds and opens. It opens completely, it begins to turn over on itself. It begins to close, it comes around, and then it's in effect the opposite of this form here. And at that point, the film continues, and it opens up in the opposite direction, ending up again here. So it's already a cycle of its own internally, and then that cycle in turn repeats ad infinitum. And here it is, an installation view at the Whitney Biennial in 2004, from the outside. And this installation shot from the inside, I think, was done at Pompidou and La Maison Rouge in Paris. And you can notice the planes that are sort of forming an internal chamber, but also notice the kind of slight marbling on the planes of light. That's actually the haze machine, which I'm now using more or less for the first time, instead of dust and cigarette smoke. Now, at this point, a train of thought began to develop, or a number of trains of thought. So I've made one, maybe 2 films those time in the new period, starting in 2003. And I'm still interested in the same material questions of light and duration and the relationship of duration to the audience attention and so on. Same ideas I was interested in the 70s. But I've also found that I developed an interest in representing the corporeal, representing the body in some way. And however, my understanding, obviously I'm not talking about in any pictorial sense, and my understanding of a body is that it isn't a thing in itself, but is an entity in a continuous state of exchange with another body or other bodies. Our existence as individuals makes no sense except in relation to others. We're the boundary of something. And I began to wonder if this continuous state of exchange in which we live, I wondered if it could be represented in some way. And I found a suggestion in an archaic cinematic bit of cinematic syntax called the wipe, which was a kind of slow cut used in the 30s and 40s instead of a straight cut, where one image visibly replaces another. Instead of just going shot 1, boom, shot 2, that's a cut. you had shot one, shot two gradually covering over the previous shot. And I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you an example of one from Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Sorry. Okay. But you should look at it one more time. Now, a wipe like that lasted half a second. And it struck me as being really suggestive. And I began to wonder, well, what if a wipe, instead of lasting half a second, what if it lasted 10 minutes? And what if the wipe became the entire piece? Cinema has the ability of keeping two stories going at once, parallel action. And I was speculating that perhaps the wipe could be used to make kind of sculptural equivalent of that parallel action. And so the idea would be that I could maintain two completely independent forms in one three-dimensional entity. So here are my two building blocks. On the left, there's an elliptical form, and it has its behavior is as follows. It essentially contracts and expands, let's say like a lung. It's in one dimension, one axis, and it does so very slowly. Now the other form is actually a dual form. It's made of a travelling wave and a straight line. So the travelling wave, what the travelling wave does, independently of any other form, is to move slowly through the frame. And what the straight line does is to float, very much like a plank on the ocean. So plank goes up and the wave passes through it. It changes angle, it drops down, it changes angle again, it comes up. That's very useful if you're talking to a vertical figure. The spectator is a vertical entity, so that plane of light is moving up and down your body as you watch. Anyway, so these are two, so let's call these two independent entities, and they act, each of them acts independently of one another. So, let's take a look at this. Here we have a wipe in action at actual speed from a piece called You and I Horizontal. So you can see the elliptical form on the left, travelling wave in the straight line. I'm also making a sculptural object, and in sculptural terms, the form that's produced by these lines is always complete. It's just that the sculptural object is always complete. It's just that it's slowly mutating continuously. So the wipe has become pretty much at the centre of each of my recent works, and what I rather like about it is that the wipe is the one invisible part of the whole process, but it's the thing that's doing most of the work. Now, I'd like to talk about verticality a little bit. This is while I was making the horizontal works, which are the better known of my solid light works, I was also simultaneously making vertical pieces. They're identical to the horizontal in scale, so it's either 10 meters across or 10 meters up. And but now what happens with these vertical pieces, it gets slightly disconnected from cinema, which we think of as a horizontal thing, and perhaps begins to have more, well, certainly much more strong sculptural references. I began talking about these pieces as standing figures pretty early on without quite realizing it. But also architectural references. There are, doorways and walls and membranes and so on, and which you begin to find yourself using words that are usually applied to architecture. Oh, chambers, things like that. Here's breath in full time. Now this is also uses a wipe, but a slightly complex one. But essentially what we have this time is an elliptical form inside a travelling wave. And I thought that I would show you a shorter clip than the last, but again, actual speed, because it comes back to this question I was talking about earlier of representing the corporeal. And please imagine that this is a footprint, literally on the ground, and what you see is actually determining the shape of the tent of light. So, with these forms, there's a sense of being, this one, sense of being inside a kind of living object. Now, I'd like to look at another vertical work. This one is based on not one form, but two. And it's called Between You and I. Two forms side by side. This image gives quite a good sense of what it feels like to walk into one of the chambers created by these vertical works. And the other thing I'd like to point out is how far away the second image is in the background. I mean, each of these footprints is 4 meters or so. A meter between them, so 9 meters from one end to the other. So I'll be talking about structure next, but you have to walk the structure. So when you're looking inside one form and you're studying it, you can't actually see what's going on in the one next door. And that becomes quite an interesting problem. So here is a set of screen grabs for 3-minute intervals for one cycle. And if we just look at the top row for a minute, this one, you see we begin with our same syntax as I discussed earlier. We begin with travelling wave bisected by a line, and as time goes on, this is the wipe enters at the bottom of the frame and begins to invade and cover up the travelling wave form until by the end we have an ellipse. The same thing happens in the other form, but in reverse, so that you get the ellipse is taken over by the travelling wave in a straight line. Now, in these single projector works, let's say this was just a single projector work at the top, you can only ever see a part of each of the forms. But with a double work, you actually, what's missing from here, you find here. So you can imagine that you can join this up with this, and you have a complete ellipse. And this waveform here joins up with this one, you have a complete wave. So nothing is actually missing. So you think that would be actually, you'd sort of use it up, except the problem is, the good problem is that you have to walk to find it, so you never quite catch up with the riddle. This image is just to sort of make the point that these are very social spaces in which strangers meet and talk and things, and sort of hang out. And one thing that I've noticed is how long people stay, and it is there is a sort of murmur of talking and people exploring and discussing the pieces, and which I think is probably quite important to the way they work. This is an installation view from the show I had at Hamburg Bahnhof in 2012, which was, the exhibition was called 5 Minutes of Pure Sculpture, but it's made up of individual works. That was, in the foreground, that was Meeting You Halfway, then there's Breath, which we were just looking at, then there's a double vertical work Between You and I, which we're just looking at, and behind that's Coupling. Perhaps it's just a good moment to stop very briefly and talk about slowness, because all of these works, the motion is extremely slow. And I'm sort of drawn to slowness anyway, aesthetically, but actually it has a utility, which is I found that when I make the motion quite fast, we're perfectly able to see, look at speed, just think of some of the movies you look at, you know. It's not a problem. It's not a problem, that is, with a movie, where your body is not actually needed on the voyage. It's your mind and your imagination that's engaging a movie. But sculpture requires a different kind of looking, which requires you to be mobile. And in fact, some of what is there to be discovered is done by you in motion. And I found if the motion is too fast on one of these solid light pieces, what we all do instinctively is to suddenly stop, stay frozen to the spot, and watch and wait. And on the other hand, if the motion is slow enough that it almost could be that the thing isn't even in motion, then it releases what I call sculptural looking, and people begin to move around it, which is absolutely essential. And so my sort of rule of thumb is the fastest thing in the room should be the spectator. Now I'd just like to look at one more solid light work, which is in the show, called Face to Face. It's another double work, but it's a horizontal installation. It's one in which I have the projectors on the floor, and for the first time I'm using hanging screens. So the entire work is in the middle of the space. And you can see from this installation view, this was at Sean Kelly Gallery a year ago, you have double-sided screens, which means that you can actually you can approach the piece from the back. Here's the other screen defining the space. And what's quite interesting to me about this is you can be inside, you see this line, this curving line here is forming a half cone in space, okay, which is there, a volumetric form, which these people are inside. Now when you're inside that volumetric form, half a cone, over there is the other half, only it's a line drawing, the graphic version of the same form. So if in your imagination you're inside the cone and you're taking this form in as well, you can in effect mentally construct an entire conical object. And the face-to-face is full of riddles like that. It's just one of them. But the riddles are formed because of this problem we have when we turn around. You know, when I look in this direction, my left is over there. But when I turn around here, my left suddenly moved over there, and this is a phenomenon that I play with in this work. And in order to work it out, I found, it's really quite hard to think like this. It's quite hard work for the brain. And, I found that three-dimensional storyboards were the way to go, and so I've made these quickly made paper models which enabled me to think about the graphic forms on each side of the screens and what they produce volumetrically, and also to work out the structure over time. So now you remember the two rows of black screen grabs we looked at, looking at the linear structure of between you and I. Well, this is the same thing, in fact, but with the projectors facing different directions. It's halfway across by here, and here it's almost completed itself, and up there it will be back to being a travelling wave. And then again, the reverse in this direction. This is another installation to get the same piece. Okay, finally, I'd just like to talk briefly about two projects that occurred outdoors, in public spaces. The first one was called Crossing the Elbe, and it took place in Hamburg, Germany, between March 2013 and March 2014. And it ran every night for a year. It was constructed from 3 pencil slim searchlights, each like this one. And each of these searchlights had a range of about 5 kilometers. Now in Hamburg, the River Elbe, splits into two and forms this vast urban island in the middle. And we picked 3 locations where there were tall buildings in different parts of Greater Hamburg. And on each of these buildings we placed a searchlight. And these searchlights were timed to come on every night, exactly 90 minutes after sunset, which means that each night the time they came on changed by a minute or two. And they remained on each night for 21 minutes. And for each of these searchlights, I created a score which outlined their potential changes of direction. So this was the central searchlight in the central position. And over the 12-week cycle of changes it had to cover, we got, let's see, sorry, oh yes, we have about a 30-degree change once a week, every week. The beam would change by 30 degrees. This was the searchlight that was furthest south, and so it was only facing northwards, and so about 15 degrees change every week. And this was the searchlight facing south, which had also 15-degree changes. So when you combine those three different scores, you create a matrix in which each part of the city was visited by one or more searchlights over the period of 3 months. And this is a rendering of the installation at night. City of Hamburg is the light up here. This is the island of Wilhelmsburg, and this is Harburg. And just a few shots from the ground. The thing is about the pieces, there's no grandstand position. There's no way you can see. There were places where you could occasionally see all 3 beams. There were quite a few places where you could see 2 at once, and mostly you just saw 1. And over the period of a year, we would gradually put it together or not. thing about public projects, I think, that's interesting to me is that you don't look at them. They can't be looked at in the way something is looked at in a museum space, for instance, where you know you're coming to look at art. There's a sort of distracted way in which they're looked at. You can have an accidental spectator. Somebody may not know exactly what it is, and it becomes part of the fabric of the city for a while. You can see here that the beam is showing space between the moon and the buildings. I was very struck by really how quiet considering its considerable scale as a work, it was actually quite a quiet event. And the city seemed to be the thing that was buzzing and humming and flashing and so on. And the beam sometimes seemed to be the most stationary thing in the city. Okay, just to finish, there's one final brief project. Now this one is called Crossing the Hudson, and it was conceived some years ago and it's still unrealized to date. It was imagined for the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge, which is 90 miles north of Manhattan. The bridge used to carry freight trains that carried coal from Pennsylvania to New England, but as a freight bridge it's disused. And my project imagined that each strut was lined, each of these struts was lined by programmable LED white lights. So every centimetre is therefore programmable. And the idea was that night after night, the bridge is very, very gradually illuminated. So in fact it takes 6 months to complete the lighting of it. So this is a speed of something like a few meters per night. So this shows the bridge, say, a couple of months after it begins lighting up. Now, if we map that lighting and unlighting cycle onto the calendar, we can then arrange things so that the bridge is the most lit up during the darkest months of the year and the least lit during the summer months. So I have it beginning in the middle of June when it's dark. As time goes on, it gradually lights up until it's fully lit late December. And then it simply begins unlighting until at the end of 1 year it's completely dark again. And this was conceived as something that would continue over years, as a continuous cyclical installation. So I've come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks a lot for your attention. Be free to visit the exhibition. It's open right now. It's one floor below the entrance for those who don't know. Thank you very much.